I would like to welcome you to session 2, When Timelessness Becomes a Bypass, Making Whole Geometric Time and the Shadow Work of Mystical Research in a Meta-Crisis. So again, my name is Nida Kulshaw, and this session is part of the MSR Research Colloquium 2026, The Mystical and Research, Dwelling at the Threshold of Knowing. This is organized by the MSR Research Committee and is supported by the wonderful presenters that we have with us today and in this session. And during the session, should you have a technical issue or question, please contact Raja Kanuri via the chat, so you'll be able to find him there. Now, I would like to jump right in and introduce our speaker, Daniel Brafman, by highlighting 3 things that I found interesting about him as it relates to this session. So first, I was really interested in your path moving from high performance optimization to wholeness and integration, and that journey between those sort of pieces of the puzzle. His biography describes a turning point during endurance racing when the performance path began leading him away from his wholeness, and he shifted towards a deeper, more integrated orientation where health becomes architecture and leadership becomes coherence. So I actually really appreciated some of the terminologies and how those are connected to thinking about our bodies and thinking about how we are connected to the outer and inner worlds. The second, his work appears to hold transformation, in my view, as a whole systems work, rather than treating life segments over here and over there in isolation. It's mapping this inner experience, measurable health, relationships and culture and system and environment, and trying to harmonize all of these elements. I think of that siloed effect that has happened with our science, which is also very helpful, but it also creates sometimes divisions and separation. And so I really appreciated that approach. And the third, as someone for myself who works with appreciative inquiry and transformational coaching, I noticed that there was a real resonance in the way that you emphasized on relational containers, trust, curiosity, co-intelligence. I like to use also collective intelligence when I talk about some of these things, and transforming one's way of being, not just upgrading what one does. And this idea of the being and the doing, and I also loved the deepness and the deepening of the being. With that, I'm going to warmly welcome Daniel and invite us all into this session with curiosity, presence, and openness to what may emerge at the threshold of knowing. And just one little administrative note that Daniel and I had a quick exchange, and you are, although there is a 15-minute sort of set Q&A time at the end, if there is something that emerges for you while the conversation is going, while the exchange, during the presentation, do feel free to raise your hand so that we can then engage in a conversation. Because if I understand it, Daniel, that is a space that you really enjoy. So I pass it to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's beautiful to be here with you all. And I have one request for the sake of intimacy, that if you're on the call and you're willing and able, I'd like to actually see you, not just a holding place. Despite the lack of mirror neurons, there's still a connection here, and I'd like to keep it best we can. So, and let's just begin with a little bit of a landing. So I'd like everybody just to take in a deep breath and exhale. And on the next in-breath, breathing in, I know that I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I know I'm breathing out. Breathing in, I'm breathing in. Out, I'm breathing out. Breathing in, I'm breathing into my whole body. I'm breathing out from my whole body. I'm breathing into my whole body. I'm breathing out from my whole body. I'm breathing into my tension. I'm breathing out my tension. I'm breathing into my tension. I'm breathing out my tension. Breathing in, I know that I am here. Breathing out, for that I am glad. I know that I am here. For that I am glad. Just sit with that for a moment. We're not in a hurry. And while we're sitting in this space of coherence and harmony, which is our relaxed state, I'd like to actually just already lean into an image, a guided space that will end with 3 minutes of silence. So I'd like you to imagine you're on a quiet, pristine beach. The tides are shifting. Low tide is moving into high tide. You see the force and the change of the tides taking down the construct of the sandcastles. Just reminding us of the impermanence of things within the infinite. And think about what we're really, really witnessing at the point. You know, the two most abundant molecules on the planet in direct relation, water and silica. Neither dominates. All civilization, all biosphere depends on what happens in their meeting. In the human move, we saw through sand into glass. No extraction, transformation. Same silica, now transparent, biologically safe, a container that lets you see what it carries without altering it. An old saying from my mother's soap opera days, like sands through an hourglass, so are the days of our lives. The hourglass says time runs out. Your influence is bounded by the sand you're given. The beach says otherwise. Your influence is bounded by the sand you're given. The beach, the pattern of your presence, the morphic pressure you leave in the relational field. You do not empty out when the hourglass does. We are also the glass itself. When you're ready, just bring your attention back to the screen, back to the room. What a strange idea, going to the beach and realizing that you are literally sitting on the crease of all reality. Silica, just like carbon, you don't exist without it. Water, the most ubiquitous molecule in the universe. There is no place that we've studied that we cannot find at least the molecule of water. Neither one of those seem to run out, no matter how big the storm, no matter what we want to dig up and take away. It all seems to have this pattern of restoration. And that's something that I think is really, really important to remember in our time right now, in our time of meta crisis, of really, what we're dealing with beyond just being equanimous in our own selves, but trying to understand how that process, how that mystical practice works for the world that believe that everything needs to be measured to be real. How do we cross that bridge, walk across the bridge, and then step into the other place without the research, without the measurements? And it also creates a conundrum in our science. Most mystical research operates in the third person or the first person. The first person is the meditator, it's the interior sciences. The third person is the observer, the one watching. And there seems to be, sort of a break in communication that is almost like trying to reconcile the two sciences of physics. We're just trying so hard to make the mystical scientific. And in the scientific world, that means give measurements, give numbers, give data, give words, give definitions. And the mystical, in my opinion, really is knowable but ineffable. And there is a way, I believe, to know how to kind of cross that bridge, how to share that space. And that's actually the space that seems to be missing. And it has to do with our understanding of temporality, our understanding of different time frames operating all simultaneously, but we tend to bracket things. We tend to, regardless of how fast things seem to be moving, we're very, very much fixated on chronos time, on unidirectional segments defined by how long something is or isn't. And, at the same time, in our interior sciences, we drop into something that's much more like geometric time. It's the milieu. It's our inner milieu. It's our shape. It's the dimensionality that isn't, from here to there. It has depth. It has breadth. It has fluctuations. It's dynamic. And so we get to have both experiences as observer, the person that might be, reading a functional MRI. And we also have a tendency to want to just kind of sit back and watch. And that, again, it ignores something that's in the middle, which is the fact that we're simply watching it is also generating it. Again, so these time frames, these dimensionalities of time and space, they already get skewed by the linearity, by the first person insistence of it's all just feelings, which is something I run into quite a lot in many of these spaces, what I call the feelings police. Oh, you're all in your head, Daniel, don't tell me what you think, tell me what you feel. You know, and what I feel is ineffable as the mystery itself. You know, so I find that there's a gap in that space. But really, the part that I think we need to focus on the most is how much shadow exists by not recognizing the second person. The second person is the relationship. It's a relationship between the observer and the observed. It's the conversation. Even in silence. I think anybody on this call who's a regular meditator knows very often you may have some of the best communication, best sharing of truth between people in total silence. It's a presence. And because we are operating 1 foot in and 1 foot out of, as Nada said earlier, you know, the siloed world, seems to be this stuckness, this need to put everything in terms of a language that actually makes what we're explaining not what it is. You know, when I read, you know, report after report of scholars who have gone to study, you know, they get I don't know, they get a fellowship and they go and study at a Zen monastery. And then they, you know, at near the end of their time there, they'll go, you know, to the Jinpo or whoever's in charge and say, you know, when am I going to get this? And of course, the answer is always when you stop watching and start practicing. We need to be engaged. We need to be in conversation with what we're studying. We need to recognize our shadows by bifurcating the time, bifurcating also the positions. You know, if you are the observer and you have any understanding of quantum science, you'll know that your observation is generating much of what you're observing. So how can you be entirely separate from what we're observing? This is a real shadow space in the science between, you know, mystical and the quote unquote scientific. There's much that we can't measure, but we can know. And everybody here, because this is of interest to you, I'm sure understands the conundrum. How do I maintain credibility in the world that wants specificity, that wants me to prove it? So we do our best to come up with studies that verify the value of what we're doing. You know, the Dalai Lama's, you know, closest students being studied, you know, under functional MRIs doesn't change their experience whatsoever with the relationship with the mystical. But all of a sudden now we have a mystical practice that's become biohacking. It's become goal-oriented. And we also have, you know, something that I witness quite often, which is we have this romanticized view of the mystic, you know, whether it's, you know, the return to being interested in shamanism, you know, the healers of their communities, the people that were, you know, the seers and the sayers and understanding things that, you know, it took maybe 100 generations of accumulated sharing of stories to really fully understand and be able to communicate. And That's a beautiful thing, and that definitely needs to be at some level restored. But there's a golden shadow in that. And that is, those are happening at a time when, the maximum number of the size of the community was somewhere around 125. The scales don't work. The landscape of then is not the landscape of now. And the other thing, which I think is very important, and it gets hidden in this golden shadow space, is there are times in life where we need to be disturbed by reality. And a lot of the mystical spaces, a lot of the meditation spaces, as biohacking, are meant to make it so that you just don't react. It's not in the Taoist sense of Wu Wei. It's not heightened attention to knowing when action is called for and when action isn't called for, and staying in the isn't as long as you can. It's literally a bypass. It's a checking out. It's an inability to handle the fact that we are in a time space for the first time on this planet where there is a meta crisis, a planetary catastrophic risk that if we don't change, we don't continue. And I hear often, even in the spiritual space, it's to the universe, it's like, it's a shrug. It's like, but we are living value. We are something. As long as we're in communication, as long as we're in conversation, we're expressing the value of being human. And how does that show up in our science? How does that show up in the shadow space? Well, I need to be completely objective and sit back and just report what I see, report what I can measure, is one of the aspects that is the most common, quote unquote, siloed space of science. It even de-edifies the viewer as the influencer. It's just keep me out of it. And at the other end of it, the practitioner, the interior sciences of it, more often than not, are seeking comfort more than anything. And that's a valid reason to do what we do. We all need to be comfortable. We all need to get our cortisol rhythms in check. We do. We all need to be able to sleep through the night. We all need to have, healthy metabolisms, good digestive tracts, all of those things, which are definitely enhanced with the practice of the interior sciences. But it's also creating this shrug to what is right in front of us. Carrying capacity of the planet. Every measure that I know of has been exceeded a long time ago, and we keep pushing. We keep racing to the bottom. And we're using the study of mysticism and we're using the practices of mysticism, which I genuinely believe, are essential to us solving what needs to be solved, to us understanding deeply, because the way of nature, whether, we call the chemicalization of the planet or not nature or not, it is the way of nature. It's very complex. There's too many different ways things are working in order to simply understand it. A plus B equals C. It just doesn't work. It has a different kind of timeline. Right now we have an acceleration of technology that has gone so far beyond our biology's ability to adapt. The timelines are just off. Biologic time is slow, and it doesn't pick up the pace regardless of where we're standing or what we're doing. It just doesn't. And yet we're running all of this information and all of these processes and all of our activities at speeds that our biology can never keep up with. And we're
Daniel?
not having this conversation.
Daniel?
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a question that is in the chat because
Hmm.
it's sort of
Okay, I didn't
aligning
see
a
the
little
chat.
bit. That's all right. It's something I wanted to read for you. So it's
Yes,
from
please.
Ravi.
Hmm.
How can mystical research guard against, and this is some words you said just recently,
Hmm.
guard against becoming a form of spiritual bypass that withdraws energy from collective responsibility, ensuring that the pursuit of timeless or transcendent insight actively contributes to tangible public good rather than disengagement from it. You'll see it in the chat, it's the very last message, if you want to have a chance to sort of look at it.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to stop sharing to see the chat. Is
Yeah,
everybody clear where we are with this schematic?
yeah, I think for the
Okay.
moment, go ahead and
Okay,
look at
good.
that.
So
And uh,
that's a beautiful, beautiful question. And it really is kind of the crux of what I'm getting at is how do we do this? How do we stop bypassing? How do we address it without, in my area of study, when I say to my teacher, how do you change the field? How do you titrate the change into the field that needs to happen without fracturing the field? We are already sitting in a place of crisis, and we're grabbing at things that do give us comfort, that do calm us down, that do, help re-regulate our hormonal systems to having a good experience. And one of the things that we have to do is we have to address the global intimacy disorder. We have to actually speak to what we're doing, and we have to speak to what's happening with each other without breaking. So in this space, one of the things that we've got to start to at least ask ourselves when we're presented with a possible equanimity practice, something that will calm us down, something that will keep us in a space of comfort, is we have to explain that's not what equanimity is for. It's all creek bed. Right? The water flows as the water needs to flow, and the creek bed adjusts as it needs to adjust. But if we go in and the only reason why we're meditating is to feel better, that's the bypass right there. And we have to find a gentle way, a gentle way. We have to ask questions before we answer that question. We have to build that bridge, cross that bridge, get permission to stand in it, stand in the other land, and we have to find out what it is that's so crisis oriented in that other person that they would want to bypass in the first place. Why can't they be comfortable in their own skin? I'm going to take a practitioner view on that and go, sometimes we've got to look at their diets. If they're keeping their cells in a chronic state of fear because they're eating food that is toxic, or they're living in environments that are toxic, or their communication style is toxic, I can't see how we're going to actually get them to do anything other than the first things first, bypass. I just need to feel good. And that's kind of an interesting thing, I can be pretty rigid about doing things exactly, as a teacher teaches up to a point, and I remember one day having this conversation with a friend of mine about a particular brand of yoga that was to me just like a very aggressive exercise class. It wasn't yoga, it wasn't about union. It was a fashion show on steroids, basically, in a very hot room. And you know what my friend said? Daniel, that's where I started, and look who I'm sitting with right now. You start where you are. You have to let people be where they are. But if you want to be able to point them, like the Buddha pointing at the moon, you can't do that from another location. You have to do that from their location. Seeking first to understand is is not a simple thing. It's one of the hardest things that we can do. What are we trying to understand? Who are we trying to understand? And even to check our own internal nervous system around that. Maybe on any given day, I just get aggravated or agitated by the question. Like, come on, man, just accept responsibility might be what I want to say. And then, so what's the mechanism in that space? Take the pause. Know yourself. Know when you're going to get dogmatic. Know when you're going to say something that's a little bit pushy. That's a big thing for me. I'm a very forward communicator. So, and if you're the opposite of a very forward communicator, you still got to get good at asking questions. It doesn't matter. We're all practitioners. If we're if we're spiritual scientists, if we're actually trying to solve a problem, because why else would we do what we're doing? It isn't just to know. Who cares? Just simply knowing and holding on to that is narcissistic. We're not solving any problems with that. We have to be able to have the conversation. The again, to refer to my teacher, frequently says, the number one problem that we have in this, in this global, meta crisis is a global intimacy disorder. We don't know how to talk to each other, and we won't talk to each other. We take a position, we stick to our position, we hang out with people who edify our position. We're all living in these little echo chambers. And in the spiritual world in particular, there's a lot of toxic positivity that gets in the way of us having these very difficult conversations. People are just here to feel good. Okay, good. I don't want to disturb you, but the house is on fire.
Uh, And I actually had a question that you just sparked, if it's all right, if I can
Please.
ask the
Yes,
question.
indeed.
Um, when you say, and this was something that I read and you had mentioned a little bit on the slide, when you say presence becomes the research instrument. So it's something that you refer to as researcher. So when presence becomes the research instrument, because of the colloquium, I'm kind of leaning into some questions around that. What does that ask of us as participants or researchers if presence needs to be the center, either in our bodies, or the attention, even accountability? Like,
Mm.
what does that look like? How do you place that in nonlinear time of the meta crisis? How would you,
Well, we are the
yeah.
instrument of measurement. That's how I would place it. We have to be, our own sincere practitioner before we even become a researcher. We need to be able to sense clearly. We need to be able to understand what may not come out in words. We need to be able to sit with something and go, ah, I feel this in my liver. I feel this in my, whatever. There's so many different mapping systems of our bodies that have this ancient wisdom, this mystical wisdom, of, if somebody asks me a question and I feel it right under my rib cage, right here, well, then why am I angry? In the Chinese system, it's in my liver. Why am I angry? That's really what it looks like is we have to know ourselves as the instrument, not just of observation, but the instrument of measurement. We have to recognize that whether we're participating in a conversation with words, we are alive because of the conversation. When we sit and we observe a practice without practicing, we're actually disturbing the space. And that may be necessary. It may be necessary to get that level of communication going, but we need to recognize it and we need to be able to, to preface when we're saying something about what was observed and recognize that this was my own interference pattern. This is my influence on what I'm sharing and saying. We can't remove ourselves if we're actually studying the mystical. I don't think we should be removing ourselves in any of the science for that matter. But that's not why we're here today. If we can't look at the scientist as at least as important as any other aspect of what's being studied, then we're going to keep making these mistakes again and again and again. We're going to keep missing the mark, in the old-fashioned sense of the word sin, to miss the mark.
And I wanted to take a pause briefly and just ask if there were any questions from the participants and the people who are with us. Please feel free to jump in and to extend the exchange and conversation. Similar to what Ravi did, you can also place your question in the chat, and I'm sort of watching that for the moment.
Mhm.
Anil, your hand is up. Please
Yes,
go ahead.
hi. Yeah,
Hi.
apologies,
I
I
knew.
read that time. Hi, how are you? So I
Great.
just heard the last few minutes of it and everything resonates. The last sentence that if you're not practicing, you're actually violating the space because you're bringing a surface level value to sort of what's otherwise a very deep value. I like that. That's how I see it. The question is about instrument and then the naming of, you use the word scientist very often. Um, the word science has a very external sort of objective measurement and analysis kind of connotation. Do you feel that we feeling as instrument of an internal research? I mean, as a scientist also kind of feels instrument of research, that I'm just following the method kind of idea. Would it be easier if you could name the first person researcher, self-referral researcher, or mystical researcher as with some other name, mysticist, because some of it seems to rhyme a lot with poetry and those sort of sensibilities.
I couldn't love this question more. And it's going to sound like a flippant answer, but the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. We have to be very careful about our fixation on naming things, not for this conversation's sake necessarily, but the world at large goes into homeostasis, static, no time. And that's just, it fixates. That's what it is. It doesn't allow for the dynamism of life. So we could probably, within a group, agree to what do we call it. That's a very tricky question, and it's a very, very deep question for me. Studying the Tao is probably my most long-term daily thing that I do, and looking in the world and how do these things matter? And so many times it really does come back to this, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. So that could even be how you say it. This is what I call myself, but to be clear, you know, the the rose by any other name, still is sweet. We get caught up in that, and it is the conundrum of language. This is another reason why in the space of practitioners, that doesn't come up so much. If you can sit quietly with another person and leave the room feeling enlivened and enlightened by their presence, I mean, that's to me the highest order, but it's also unacceptable in most academic settings. We have to change the paradigm. We have to actually find the system, generate the system that makes the existing failing system obsolete. We don't need to tear it down. We don't need to do anything to it. When something comes along that just works better and makes more sense, then we just have to do the due diligence in making sure people know about it. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to become marketers. Does that at all help with your question?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a self-inquiry also. I have a couple of sessions coming up, and why university? Because then you brought in into academia itself, and academia has a certain history, modality, publishability, and all that sort of narrative. And part of what we are trying to get to the root of is what's the um, hardcore reason for a university to exist. And one of the things I will present, and I can even preview it here, it is the unquenchable thirst for knowledge. And that's very mystical. Why do we have that kind of thirst for knowledge? Why are we attending this here? So that kind of, to me, gets to how do we measure? I mean, the measurement, and Jerry's going to talk about measuring the unmeasurable. So, which is this whole idea that we need to sort of get out of the space-time mode where we have to size things up in terms of the dimensions of space-time, and be open and be one to with everything. And that's where this notion of practice comes in. And the other comment, if I may say, you talked about practitioners learning from and learn from each other, which is totally true. When you're group meditation, everybody comes out 10 times alive. But practitioners doesn't. The word practitioner doesn't have cachet in academia nearly as much. And so those are kind of some challenges in academia as to how we begin to uh, bring the value of the kind of work you're describing.
Mm, thank you. That's very helpful. Is there more before we go on to Jerry?
Oh, I see Jerry's hand. Go ahead, Jerry.
Well, just responding. Let me lower my hand. I forgot I have to do this. Hold on a minute. Okay. Uh, I think well, first, I have two questions. One has to do with the spiritual bypass thing that Ravi put up. But before that, just responding to what Anil and you were saying, I mean, it depends on what we consider research. The whole Academy of Management is based off this positivistic thing that comes from psychology. And it's like, in psychology, it became very positivistic, but it didn't start off that way. It started off very much as looking inward, like William James and all the original writers were really doing a lot of introspection, not all this distancing yourself and observing stuff. But
Mhm.
even the idea of research is that's just one idea of research. If you look at the way philosophers and religion people, there's a lot of now I'm advertising my session anyway. But I mean, there's a lot of different ways of looking at it, and for some reason, because we're in AOM, they're looking in a very narrow way of looking at what a researcher does. And it is
Mhm.
true that if you wanted to publish something, which is another session coming up down the road. If you wanted to publish something in one of these journals, you have to make it fit kind of what people are looking for. Um, so there's a challenge. There's other ways of doing research that might address some of these things, but how do you package them in a way that other people would consider research? That's one thing. Now, the thing with Ravi's question, I mean, I'm not quite sure what spiritual bypass means, but I know there's the thing, I think it's in Buddhism where, like just because you're looking at something with detachment doesn't mean that you're disengaged from it. You're just detached. Am I right on the, in other words, you can look at things and but not actively be upset about something. Isn't I think that's the point about detaching from it. But of course, I'm not that much of an expert on it. But you follow what I'm saying? So I don't know
Well,
what you mean by spiritual bypass, um, because I think you could be examining these things and just not get so upset with it that that you get too attached with it. I came back from a Vipassana retreat recently where they were talking about cravings and attachments,
right.
what was it? Cravings and cravings and being upset about stuff. And the point
Right.
is either one, not to crave and not to be upset. Just okay, this is the way it is. I don't know if that's making any sense with what you're saying, but
Well, thank you. It makes sense. I've done, myself 3 Vipassana um, retreats, and it's a very profoundly special and important place. And again, talk about bypassing. It's a space you're not. It's not just that you're in noble silence. When you're not in noble silence and you want to have a conversation, it's discouraged.
yeah, you
It's
could, yes. When I
discouraged to
was
talk about your experience. It's there, there's still a vast and radical intimacy disorder in that space.
yeah, yeah.
You
The
know,
one
you
I was at, you're not even allowed to look at each other. There was
right.
total nothing, right?
But there's a point at which when you are allowed to, what seems to get shut down, in my experience, is questions about the experience itself. You go to the assistant teacher. I did this, and I asked. The only time I ever asked this particular assistant teacher, because I had him a couple times, anything. I explained to him how I was having the experience, and then because I was aware of the experience, it was it was amplifying that in other parts of my scanning. And this is how he answered it. Well, maybe the Vipassana is just not for you.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing, but the bypassing thing, I'm going to be very, very specific. And I'm going to use more current marketing language. When meditation and other spiritual practices are used to get a specific result that are very goal oriented, it's a bypass.
So this would be like getting high, like taking, smoking marijuana or taking some substance just so you can escape, right? Just getting high. Is that what you're talking about? That kind of thing, right?
Well, yeah, I probably wouldn't frame it that way, but I'll accept it. If all you're trying to do is escape, then yes, it's a bypass from doing the work. If you're not willing to look at your life and say, why am I unhappy?
Mhm.
And say, well, I don't even need to ask that question because I've live in a state where, smoking weed is, legal and it's easy to get and it's really strong. And, I can just, if I'm in a bad mood, I can just smoke. That's a bypass,
Yeah, okay, I get that.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also a sacred plant. So I want to be clear. There's a place in the world for, connecting with nature at these levels. These molecules are very sacred things. But yes, I come from the longevity space. I'm highly educated, as a kinesiologist in this space. And I talk to people all the time and they say, I meditate because it makes me a better business person. It makes me less reactive so that I'm better at kind of playing the game. That's what I would call a bypass.
I see another hand. Anil, did you have another
Yeah,
question?
yes. I would, because this discussion is going into this idea. I've also done Vipassana 6 times, 6 courses. The question of ontology comes in, when we are talking about measuring, who are we to begin with? And
Hmm.
I've discussed that in a more sort of a strategic HRM kind of sense also,
Mhm.
because, we talk of human resource. I mean, the whole resource part is going away. What is the human to begin with? Who are we? Who am I? How do you address that question? What would be your answer to who am I?
It's tough if it's just framed, in the context of management, because that gets it gets a little tricky in what's allowed and what's not allowed. It is ultimately the most intimate question, meaning it's a question we have to ask ourselves. And the better that we can get at shedding identities, this is the I am practice. You can go, 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 and maybe you'll get to a place of just pure awareness, as I'm sure you've heard that as kind of the ultimate answer. But even then, I think, and this is where science comes into play, epigenetics of things, our DNA. I mean, the whole history of humanity is within our code. It's within these inverted double vortexes bridged by knots. That is, it's the encyclopedia of everything that's ever happened, and it sets us up for what's going to happen next. That's a form of ontology in the way that you're saying, which is a much more meaningful, deeper thing at our level of conversation. And maybe, like I said earlier, that the bypass is just part of the path. I've seen people who were just, you know, some people call them, Barbie yogis or fashion yogis, who actually eventually, took it seriously and understood that yoga means union with spirit, union with the ineffable, and it might have taken them 10, 12 years to get there. So it's not that I'm saying that a bypassing person is bad or doing wrong, but we have to locate them in their development. If they're infantile in their spiritual growth, we have to let them be narcissistic. We have to let every baby is the ultimate narcissist. They just need. It's everything is them, and that's actually, it's a model of all development. If something's new and it's tender and it's exploring, it has to make mistakes. But when do we run interference on the mistakes? That's the real hard part. When do the mistakes start to become damaging to the whole?
Daniel, I wanted just to jump in here because there are two questions. There's one in the chat, and then I believe Nelson also wanted to give a comment. So I just wanted to alert you to the message from Ravi. And Ravi
Okay.
is, it's in the chat. If you
I
want
see
to
that.
read, if you could read that, and because I won't read it out loud, but if you could read it and then give us your comments, that would be lovely. And then Nelson, I'll go ahead and give you a shout out as soon as we have a response to Ravi, okay?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Robbie, I think if we can evolve that statement, I would 100% agree with it. I'm very wary of dropping into a guru space where you don't know unless you've been told by your teacher. I think that um, really ultimately the best teachers are the ones who are working with the earlier development spaces. And to quote Hua Ching Ni, who deep in the Tao teachers and in the I Ching, says, we all need teachers at the beginning to be able to distinguish the difference between impulse and intuition. So in that space of, having a teacher, having somebody leading us, I think I'd like to be able to evolve that. I think there was a time when it served, when things were smaller and people lived in those communities. And I think that, our problems are just too big, that we eventually have to become able to clarify within our own selves, is that so? And There are just so many, 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 many stories of great teachers that that stepped beyond what was right and wrong. A lot of great teachers, have taught many, many great lessons and also done some pretty bad things to their students. So I get a little bit, personally, I get a little sensitive in that space of not wanting to just automatically agree. I know that's the way it was, and I think that part of that still needs to be, but it needs to be evolved. And I think that we should be teaching, the teachers should be teaching people to become teachers versus to stay perpetually stuck on the teacher.
And I'm going to bring in Nelson. Nelson, do you want to go ahead and ask your comment
Yeah.
or make your comment? Sorry.
So I'm hearing a lot of things in here today, very interesting. Um, but one of the things I'm hearing is that bypass, and I think as a practitioner of Vipassana for the last 25 years, um, it's a unique journey where you feel like you want to have this ideal being person, right? You want to become something perfect. And I believe that is a process that we go through, and eventually we recognize that we have to let that go.
Mm.
And ultimately, um, there is no path because you're not going anywhere. And the analogies that I use to explain that are two. One is in spirituality, we're trying to find the water as if we were a fish. We are in the water and we're trying to find it.
Hmm.
Another way is that I explain it is like the sky. We are the sky. The sky is always there. And everything under the sky is the conditioning. The sun, the moon, the earth, the cars, the people, the nature, all of that is conditioning. And so all humans have that ability to have pure awareness, but we hardly pay direct our attention to the sky place, which is the pure awareness, is what it doesn't judge, that wasn't criticize anything, that doesn't take anything personal. And the challenge that we have in research is that we treat everything with the intellect, and the intellect is all conditioned. And so we can't really see even the research that we do for the other fields that we belong to. There is always the intellect and that conditioning that arises without even having any control of it. I mean, we are so conditioned in everything we do, and it's all reactionary. And so, including that bypass, we've been trained to look always for the good feeling, for the good moment.
Hmm.
And we become so tough on everybody else because we can't accept to have anything within us that doesn't work. If we have anger today and I can't accept it that is arising within me, I won't accept it in somebody else. So that's my
Mm.
comment.
Mm. Was there a question in the comment?
I think it was a comment.
Yeah.
And we're coming to the close, and so I wanted you to have a chance, Daniel, to respond to it, and then I'm going to close our session.
Well, I think, just to follow you through on, my evolutionary urge to be better, not just be historical. Um, Perhaps we are not, as individuals going anywhere, but as a whole on of humanity, we're definitely going somewhere. And when I look at the health history of the last 20 years, when I look at the rates of autism, when I look at the rates of autoimmune conditions, when I look at the rates of suicide and etc., there are many things that, like you say, we should learn how to be uncomfortable. That's the equanimity part. That's the Vipassana part. It's not to say that we're not uncomfortable. It's that we actually have to learn how to live with being uncomfortable. That's the ultimate question. How good are you at being uncomfortable with yourself? I think is a very important thing. But I think, it's also important to evolve the interior sciences to the collective. As Thich Nhat Hanh said before his passing, the Buddha of the future is the Sangha. It's the satsang. It's the spiritual community. When we can start to recognize that we are going somewhere, but it's a we. When is it okay to lean in and go, hey, that's not okay? When and how do you manage, using all of the systems of the ancients and bringing them into the modern times? How do you master Wu Wei instead of just equanimity? Just, living with it versus knowing exactly when to not do and knowing exactly when to do what is mine to do.
And with that, I'm going to close our session. I want to first thank you, Daniel, for guiding us through this session, for the exchange, for sharing your work, reflections, and your presence with us. I want to thank everybody who joined and participated with your exchanges and questions. I appreciated that as well, and your insights. Before we close, I would like to just briefly highlight what's coming next in the colloquium. We'll have about a 15-minute pause approximately. Our upcoming sessions include engaging with meditative inquiry and teaching research and creation. That's presented by Ashwani Kumar. The next after that is When Rigor Forbids Insight, Mysticism and Transformation of the Researcher with Tom Cullen. And then after, The Mystic as Researcher, that's going to be presented by Judy Neal. So I warmly invite you to continue joining us as we move through the gathering together, weaving these presentations and embodied practices and collective inquiry. So many thanks again for your presence in this space. And we will be moving people back into the waiting room as we prepare for the next session. Thank you very much, everybody. And I might see you in a few minutes.